They didn't bother to hide it. My son's smirk, Melissa's exaggerated sigh. As I walked into the courtroom, they looked me up and down like I'd wandered in by mistake. Caleb even leaned over and said something that made her laugh, sharp and mean. But I kept walking. Binder in hand, heels steady, spine straighter than it had been in years. They expected a confused old woman. The judge, however, leaned forward before I even sat down and said, "You must be Mrs. Morris." And just like that, the tone shifted. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, that peculiar mix of bureaucracy and history. Della Morris stood just inside the glass doors, her hand still resting on the handle as the morning light cut across the marble floor. She adjusted her tote bag on her shoulder, heavy with files, lighter than her heart, and scanned the room for familiar faces. There they were. Melissa's laugh rang too loud for a place like this. She leaned close to Caleb, her glossy hair swinging as she whispered something sharp. Caleb's smirk came next, that thin, practiced curve that had once made Della's little boy look mischievous but now looked smug, cold even. The bailiff called. "Morris versus Morris, probate hearing." From behind the security desk. Della's fingers tightened around her bag's handle. "Responding party." The bailiff read off the docket, glancing up. "That's you, ma'am?" "Yes," she said quietly, her voice even. "That's me." Melissa turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, she made it. Early. Even." Della pretended not to hear. She was too old and too practiced to rise to bait that shallow. The whisper followed anyway, loud enough for the marble to carry it. "She probably doesn't even know what that means." Della's tote landed gently on the wooden bench. From inside, she drew out her color-coded binder, the blue tabs for assets, green for medical documentation, yellow for correspondence. Every page was protected in a sleeve. She'd spent nights under the hum of her kitchen light building it, each divider a piece of armor. Norma Fielding was already waiting, perched with quiet patience on the next bench. She looked like she'd stepped out of a deposition herself, pencil tucked behind her ear and legal pad on her lap. When Della sat down, Norma gave a half smile that didn't need words. "Time to find their tone in front of a judge," Norma murmured, voice low, solid. Della breathed in, then out. "I suppose it is." Across the lobby, Caleb leaned back in his chair, legs stretched, thumb gliding across his phone. "We've already won," he muttered to Melissa, confident enough not to whisper it. Melissa laughed again, short, dismissive, like she was at brunch with friends, not a courthouse about to decide whether she and her husband could take control of the woman sitting quietly across from them. Della studied her son for a moment longer than she meant to. His jawline was harder than she remembered. The same blue eyes, though, his father's eyes, but colder now, hollowed out by entitlement. She blinked and looked away. The courthouse clock ticked above them, the second hand slicing the air like a metronome. Each sound carried her back to the decades of mornings spent marking attendance, reading to first graders, keeping order with quiet patience, discipline by tone, not volume. She still believed in that. Dean Carver appeared then, slipping through the metal detectors with his briefcase. He spotted Della, nodded once, precisely the way men like him did when they were impressed, but too restrained to say so aloud. "Mrs. Morris," he greeted, "you brought everything we discussed?" "I did," she replied, tapping the binder. He smiled faintly. "Then we're already ahead." Melissa's voice rose again, artificially sweet, too polished. "Is that your lawyer, Della? He looks so young. Hope he's not fresh out of school." Norma's pencil scratched something onto her pad. "Don't engage." Della didn't. She simply lifted her gaze. met Melissa's eyes for one steady second, and then turned back to her attorney. The silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. The bailiff called for both parties to proceed toward courtroom 3. He gestured politely for Della to move first. Caleb rose in exaggerated slow motion, straightening his jacket as if preparing for a photo. Melissa adjusted her pearl earrings, her perfume trailing sharp as citrus. Della stood last. The click of her low heels echoed against the tile, firm and deliberate. Norma gathered her purse and followed, whispering near her shoulder, "Keep your chin up. Let them underestimate you. It's their favorite mistake." Inside, through the open courtroom doors, she could see Judge Brandt settling onto the bench, silver hair pulled tight, glasses balanced low, expression unreadable. Caleb glanced back one more time, that same smirk on his face. Della caught it, every ounce of contempt disguised as confidence, and gave him nothing in return. The bailiff announced, "All rise." Everyone stood. Della exhaled, her binder resting on the table in front of her like a shield. She looked at the judge, then at her son. The silence stretched, and just as Judge Brandt lifted her gavel to begin, Melissa leaned over and whispered, "This won't take long." Della's lips curved, just slightly. "We'll see," she thought. The first sound after the gavel's rap wasn't words. It was the faint scrape of Melissa's chair as she crossed her legs, sighing loud enough for the courtroom microphone to catch. Judge Harriet Brandt's eyes lifted, sharp and assessing. She hadn't even spoken yet, and the warning was already there, humming beneath her steady gaze. "Good morning," Judge Brandt said, voice firm and clipped. "Before we begin, I'll remind both parties that this is a courtroom, not a conversation at home. I expect respect from everyone seated before me." Melissa's smirk vanished so fast it almost made Della blink. Caleb stared at the table, jaw set. The small, pleased sound that came from Norma's corner of the gallery was nearly inaudible. A throat clearing, maybe, or just satisfaction wrapped in restraint. Dean Carver stood smoothly. "Your Honor," Dean Carver appearing on behalf of Mrs. Della Morris, the responding party. His tone was even, practiced, but there was a quiet steel underneath. Across the aisle, Caleb's attorney, a man with too much cologne and too little preparation, stood, adjusting his tie. "Good morning, Your Honor." Thomas Dellinger, representing Caleb and Melissa Morris, the petitioners in this matter. "We're here today to address concerns about Mrs. Morris's capacity and ability to manage her financial and personal affairs." The words hung there, ugly in their calmness. Della sat perfectly still, her binder resting in front of her like a silent rebuttal. Dean didn't flinch. Judge Brandt folded her hands. "You're alleging incapacity?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dellinger replied. "Mrs. Morris has exhibited patterns of confusion, questionable financial decisions, and—" Dean interrupted politely but firmly. "If I may, Your Honor, my client is neither confused nor incapable. She is, in fact, remarkably organized, as I'll demonstrate shortly." Judge Brandt gave a small nod, turning her attention to Della. "Mrs. Morris, you may remain seated. Mr. Carver, proceed." Dean opened the binder, selecting a folder labeled in Della's clean, slanted handwriting. Capacity, assets, history. He handed it across the table with quiet precision. The paper's slide across the polished wood sounded deliberate, like punctuation. "Contained here," Dean said, "are signed statements from Mrs. Morris's primary care physician, neurologist, and financial advisor. They attest to her full mental competence and her independent management of her accounts for the last 5 years." Judge Brandt began to flip through the pages. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft swish of paper. Melissa broke the silence first, her voice dripping disbelief. "She had help. There's no way she did that herself?" Della finally looked up, meeting Melissa's eyes. Not angry, just disappointed. The same look she'd used decades ago when Caleb lied about breaking a window. Quiet correction. Nothing more. Dean didn't bother responding. He simply reached into the binder again and slid forward another sheet. Della's handwritten ledger, neat and dated, ink still sharp. Judge Brandt's reading glasses caught the light as she leaned forward. "Mrs. Morris," she said, tone measured, "did you prepare this documentation yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Della answered, her voice carrying clear across the room. "Every page. Every signature verified." The judge studied her for a long beat. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Remarkable." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. His attorney leaned down to whisper something, but whatever it was didn't seem to land. Caleb's jaw tightened, his expression somewhere between irritation and panic. Dean sat back, calm and quiet, while Della folded her hands over the binder. In that stillness, she felt the smallest pulse of vindication. She'd spent months being dismissed, an old woman with too many lists. Now those lists were speaking for her. Judge Brandt turned to Dellinger. "Counsel, unless you have contrary medical evidence or financial records contradicting these, your claim seems premature." Dellinger stammered. "We, may need additional discovery time." Melissa huffed, whispering harshly, "We can't just stop now, Caleb." "Quiet," the judge said without looking up. The command landed like a hammer. For a moment, Della thought she saw it. That flicker of realization in her son's face. The first crack in the confidence he'd worn all morning. Dean leaned slightly toward Della. "You handled that beautifully," he murmured. "I only told the truth," she replied, voice low but sure. Judge Brandt looked back up from the folder, one brow lifted. "Mrs. Morris, we'll continue to review your submissions, but I'll say this. Most people your age rely on others to manage this kind of detail. You've clearly done your homework." Della allowed herself a single nod. "I was a librarian for 30 years, Your Honor. Paperwork doesn't scare me." A ripple of restrained laughter spread through the room. Even the bailiff hid a smile. Melissa crossed her arms, cheeks flushed. Caleb stared at the table again, avoiding his mother's eyes. Judge Brandt closed the folder, tapping it lightly once. "Very well. Let's proceed." Thomas Dellinger cleared his throat, shuffling through a stack of papers that suddenly looked less impressive under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. He adjusted his glasses, trying to recover the rhythm he'd lost halfway through the hearing. "Your Honor," he began, his tone half apologetic, half defensive, "we have records indicating that Mrs. Morris transferred several large sums to various accounts in recent years." Judge Brandt interrupted, her expression unmoved. "Specific dates, Mr. Dellinger. I don't accept adjectives where numbers belong." A single laugh escaped from somewhere in the back of the gallery, Norma's, short and contained. Dellinger pretended not to hear. "Well, he fumbled with the pages. "It appears some of the transactions occurred in, let's see, April of 2022 and, perhaps, September of 2023. He looked to Caleb for reassurance, but his client was busy staring at the tabletop. Dean sat motionless beside Della, pen poised above his legal pad. The moment Dellinger stumbled over the word perhaps, Della reached calmly into her binder and withdrew a slim, cream-colored folder. She tapped it once on the table before sliding it toward Dean without a word. Dean glanced down, saw the neat handwriting across the front. Notarized ledger, gifts, withdrawals, and dates, 2018-2024. He lifted it with both hands, the weight of evidence tangible even before it opened. "Your Honor," Dean said, rising, "if I may submit this into record." Dellinger's head jerked up. "Objection. We've not had time to review that document." Judge Brandt didn't even look at him. "Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Carver." Dean approached the bench, setting the folder directly in front of the judge. Della sat perfectly still as the pages were opened. She had triple-checked every entry, every line. Each date cross-referenced with the bank's printouts, each gift annotated with a small note. Birthday, graduation, emergency car repair. For 5 long minutes, the room was filled with nothing but the whisper of pages turning. The air seemed to thicken around the sound. Paper over marble, authority meeting preparation. Melissa leaned back, eyes narrowing. Her manicure caught the light as she clenched her phone, mouthing across the aisle, "Are you kidding me?" Caleb shifted, arms folded tight. He reached for his phone under the table, his thumb flicking furiously. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. "Sir, put the device down." Caleb ignored him. "Sir," the bailiff repeated, louder this time, stepping forward. The entire courtroom turned as the phone was plucked neatly from Caleb's grip. The faint click of the bailiff's holster closing around the confiscated device echoed like punctuation on a sentence he hadn't realized he'd written himself. Melissa's glare burned into him. "Real smart," she hissed under her breath. Judge Brandt closed the folder softly, looking first at Della, then at Dean, and finally back to the petitioners. "This ledger is immaculate," she said. "It records every transfer, every dollar, every purpose. All notarized with bank verification stamps. In 30 years of probate law, I rarely see this level of documentation from a legal professional, let alone from a private citizen." Dean inclined his head. "Mrs. Morris spent decades organizing school systems, Your Honor. I suspect running her own life came naturally." Della said nothing. She simply folded her hands, eyes steady, the slightest hint of color returning to her cheeks. Caleb looked at his attorney, who was now pale enough to match the fluorescent lights. "You said she didn't have anything like that," he whispered harshly. I didn't think she..." "She did," Melissa cut in, voice like broken glass. Norma's grin in the gallery was slow and deliberate, a quiet victory no one could take from her. She met Della's gaze and gave a subtle nod, the kind of nod that said they're unraveling. "Stay calm." Judge Brandt tapped the folder once with her pen. "This document disproves the allegation of concealed or mismanaged assets. Unless the petitioners have factual evidence to the contrary, I suggest they reconsider the strength of their claims before we proceed further." Dellinger's papers trembled in his hands. "Your Honor, we may need additional time to..." "You'll have none until you produce something real," Judge Brandt interrupted, her tone cutting. "Court isn't theater, Mr. Dellinger." A flush crept up Caleb's neck. Melissa leaned forward, whispering something fierce, but Della didn't hear the words. Her focus was on the judge, whose expression had softened almost imperceptibly. Respect, not sympathy. Dean leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perfectly executed, Mrs. Morris." Della didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched just enough. "I told you," she murmured. "I don't forget details." The next morning of testimony carried the thick, electric quiet that only comes after someone's been caught underestimating the wrong person. Even the bailiff's footsteps seemed gentler when he opened the courtroom door for Della and Dean. Caleb and Melissa were already seated at their table, a little too still, their attorney wearing the brittle calm of a man trying to glue a broken argument back together. Melissa's phone was gone, confiscated yesterday, never returned. Caleb's tie was crooked. Judge Brandt entered with the same unhurried authority as before, her robe swishing softly as she took her seat. "All rise," the bailiff called. Once they were seated again, Brandt leaned forward. "Mr. Dellinger, I trust you've reviewed your client's claims overnight. Do you still intend to pursue the allegation of financial instability?" Dellinger nodded too quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe Mrs. Morris's spending habits reflect impulsivity and poor money management." Della didn't move. Dean didn't blink. Norma, seated 2 rows back, folded her hands and waited for the storm to pass. Or hit. Proceed, Judge Brandt said. According to the documents provided, Dellinger began, flipping through his notes as if they might spontaneously organize themselves. Mrs. Morris's checking account shows numerous withdrawals and transfers to unverified entities. We contend this pattern demonstrates. Dean rose, smooth as clockwork. Your Honor, my client has provided full bank statements verifying every transaction. I'd like to submit them into record now. Judge Brandt extended a hand. Let's see them. Della reached into her binder, this time for a stack of color-coded envelopes. The tabs read, charitable donations, grocery purchases, utilities, medical expenses. She passed them to Dean without looking up, her composure immaculate. Dean handed the first envelope to the clerk. Exhibit C through H, he said. Each includes date-stamped statements and matching receipts. The judge took her time opening the top packet. Inside were not just numbers but the story of a steady, principled life. Monthly checks to the church pantry, small recurring donations to the animal shelter, careful grocery purchases never exceeding her budget. Brandt's brow lifted slightly. These show consistent activity and zero debt. Dellinger cleared his throat. Perhaps they were recently compiled? Melissa couldn't help herself. She probably just made all this up last week, she muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Dean didn't react. He simply retrieved the next packet, sliding it forward with quiet finality. Utility bills, Your Honor. 14 months of them, verified and paid on time. Brandt flipped through the stack. Water, power, gas, internet. Every bill marked paid in neat blue ink. She looked back at Melissa, her gaze sharp as a pin. Mrs. Morris, do you have evidence this information is fabricated? Melissa's face went crimson. No, but you assumed, the judge finished for her. That's not evidence. Caleb shifted beside her, his jaw tight. He finally spoke, voice low but defensive. We're just trying to make sure she's stable. We worry about her. Della turned her head slowly, her calm unnerving in its precision. Stable? She echoed. You mean because I keep records? Because I don't need you to manage what I've already managed for decades? Her voice wasn't angry. It was soft, level, but each word landed like the click of a lock. Dean leaned forward slightly. Your Honor, my client's so-called instability has a paper trail most banks would envy. Her spending, her savings, her taxes, all accounted for. The petitioners, however, have yet to provide a single verified instance of misconduct. Judge Brandt tapped her pen once, the sound crisp against the desk. Then she turned her eyes on Caleb. Did you personally verify any of your accusations before bringing them to this court? Caleb blinked. Well, no. But that will be enough. Her voice cut through him like glass. If you file claims of incompetence, you verify them. You don't guess. You don't assume. And you certainly don't waste the court's time because you dislike how your mother spends her money. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Norma's grin flickered again, small and proud. Dellinger tried to recover. We can gather further documentation if... You'll gather credibility first, Brandt said, stacking Della's evidence neatly before her. Dean sat back, the faintest trace of satisfaction in his expression. Della inhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders at last. Across the aisle, Melissa turned away, muttering something sharp enough that Caleb didn't dare answer. The judge looked toward the clock. This court will reconvene tomorrow at 10 for continuation of financial review. Petitioners are strongly advised to come prepared, with facts. The third day of hearings dawned gray and humid, the kind of Savannah morning that made even courthouse air feel thick. Della sat at her table, binder already open to a tab labeled Property. Dean was methodical beside her, his tie straight, his calm unshaken. Norma waved from the gallery, a thermos of coffee cradled like a trophy. Caleb and Melissa entered late. He looked haggard. She looked furious. Their attorney trailed behind, trying to look confident and failing spectacularly. Judge Brandt didn't bother with pleasantries. "We're continuing with the financial review," she said, flipping to her notes. "Mr. Dellinger, you're still asserting that the property in question, the residence on Hawthorne Avenue, is subject to dispute?" Dellinger cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. The petitioners believe the home remains part of Mrs. Morris's unprotected estate." Dean glanced at Della, then rose. "Respectfully, Your Honor, that belief is outdated." Brandt looked up over her glasses. "Outdated?" "Yes, ma'am." Dean picked up a single folder from Della's binder and carried it to the bench. 2 years ago, my client placed her home into a living trust, legally recorded, notarized, and witnessed. The trust remains active and names Mrs. Morris as both trustee and primary beneficiary. He paused just long enough for the words to settle. There are no co-trustees, no secondary owners. The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice through the air. Caleb's hand twitched on the table. "That's not possible," he said under his breath, but the microphone caught it anyway. Dean didn't respond. He simply handed the folder to the clerk. The top page gleamed under the overhead light. Official, stamped, dated nearly 24 months prior. Judge Brandt examined the seal, flipping through the notarized signatures and witness forms. "Executed on April 12th, 2 years ago," she murmured. "Registered with the county recorder's office the following week." Her eyes flicked up. "Mr. Dellinger, were you aware of this trust?" Dellinger froze. "No, Your Honor. My clients, had reason to believe." Melissa leaned toward Caleb, whispering harshly, "You said she hadn't done anything yet." Caleb's voice cracked. "She hadn't. She told me she was still thinking about it." Della turned her head slowly, her calm expression cutting cleaner than any outburst. "I did say that, Caleb. 2 years ago, you asked me what I was planning. I didn't think you needed to know what I'd already done." Melissa scoffed. "So you hid it?" "I protected it," Della replied simply. Dean retrieved the next page, the trust summary, and handed it across to the judge. "As you can see, Your Honor, the trust covers the full property, including all improvements and its contents. Mrs. Morris's late husband's name remains as an honorary benefactor, per her wishes. It's airtight." Judge Brandt flipped through a few more pages. Then, for the first time in 3 days, the faintest hint of a smile touched her face. "Mr. Carver," she said dryly, "I assume your client prepared this with counsel?" Dean shook his head. "She prepared the initial draft herself. I reviewed it last year when she came in for estate updates. Everything was already in order." The judge's eyebrows lifted. "Impressive." Melissa sank back in her chair, her carefully curated confidence unraveling. "You have got to be kidding me," she whispered. Dellinger fumbled with his papers, desperate for footing. "Your Honor, I must point out that, this may change the nature of our petition. We weren't aware the property had been transferred?" Brandt finished for him. "Legally and completely? 2 years ago?" She tapped the trust documents once, neatly aligning the corners before sliding them back toward the clerk. "Then the home was never part of this case to begin with." Her gaze fixed squarely on Caleb. "Which means the claim you filed, asserting ownership of this property, was fraudulent." Caleb's face drained of color. I didn't know." "You signed under penalty of perjury," Brandt interrupted, her tone glacial, "claiming rights to property you neither owned nor verified." Dean sat back, his hands folded. Della kept her gaze on the judge, not her son. The ache behind her ribs was old and familiar, but it didn't shake her anymore. Judge Brandt continued, "Mr. Morris, ignorance is not a defense. Your mother's trust predates your petition by 23 months. That means your filing was false on its face. I will be referring this document to the clerk for review and possible sanctions." A murmur broke through the gallery, half shock, half admiration. Even Norma looked momentarily stunned before a slow smile curved her lips. Melissa turned to Caleb, eyes wide. "You said she hadn't done it yet." Caleb slammed his hands on the table. "She tricked us." Brandt's gavel hit the wood, sharp and final. "She followed the law, Mr. Morris. You assumed you could take what wasn't yours." Dean's voice was quiet but firm. "And that assumption ends today." Della's fingers brushed the edge of her binder. Every tab, every page, every careful line had led to this moment. The courtroom felt different that morning. Calmer on Della's side, heavier on theirs. The air itself seemed to carry consequence. Caleb sat stone-faced, staring at the tabletop, while Melissa's constant fidgeting drew every ounce of attention she tried so hard to command. Dellinger looked like a man begging for a reset button. Judge Brandt began without ceremony. "We'll resume with witness testimony. Mr. Carver, you may proceed." Dean rose. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Norma Fielding to the stand." A ripple of approval moved through the gallery. Norma stood, straight-backed and steady, adjusting her cardigan as she made her way to the witness chair. She placed her right hand on the Bible, swore her oath, and settled in with the composure of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for this exact kind of reckoning. Dean approached with respectful distance. "Ms. Fielding, how long have you known Mrs. Morris?" 43 years, Norma replied, voice clear and sure. "We started working together at Whitman Elementary in 1981. She was head librarian. I was a paralegal back then before I switched to admin work." "Would you describe Mrs. Morris as organized?" Norma chuckled softly. "If organization were a martial art, she'd have a black belt. I've seen her catalog 1,200 books, color code a fundraiser budget, and still have time to bake cookies for the janitorial staff." Dean smiled faintly. "And in your opinion, does Mrs. Morris demonstrate clear understanding of her personal and financial matters?" "She understands them better than most people half her age. She keeps records, cross-checks them, and files duplicates off-site. When she started suspecting her son might misunderstand her intentions, she asked me to remind her of every safeguard she could take. She didn't panic. She planned." Melissa let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. The courtroom froze. Judge Brandt's head turned slowly, her expression cold enough to drop the room's temperature. "Mrs. Morris, Melissa Morris, if you interrupt one more time, I'll have you removed. Do I make myself clear?" Melissa's cheeks burned crimson. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good." Brandt leaned back. "Proceed, Mr. Carver." Dean nodded to Norma. "When you say Mrs. Morris planned, could you elaborate?" "Of course," Norma said, sitting straighter. "She didn't just prepare paperwork, she educated herself. She went to workshops, asked questions, and even double-checked her attorney's language. When I reviewed her trust last year, it was flawless. She's precise, not paranoid." Dean smiled. "Thank you. No further questions." Dellinger stood, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ms. Fielding, are you personally benefiting from Mrs. Morris's estate?" Norma arched a brow. "Not a dime. I benefit from her friendship, not her finances." "And you claim she's of sound mind?" "I don't claim it," Norma said coolly. "I know it." Dellinger hesitated, flipped a page, then sighed. "No further questions?" Norma stepped down from the stand, giving Della's shoulder a reassuring squeeze as she passed. "Told you we'd get to the truth," she whispered. Dean moved next, sliding 2 sealed envelopes toward the clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to submit notarized letters from Mrs. Morris's primary care physician and financial advisor. Both attest to her full capacity and consistent management of assets. Brant gestured for them. Let's see. She opened the first envelope. The letter was short, typed on crisp stationery. Mrs. Morris displays no signs of cognitive decline. She maintains autonomy in all personal and financial decisions. Signed, dated, and notarized. The second letter bore an embossed seal from her financial firm, confirming her steady growth, regular review sessions, and prudent investment behavior. Brant read each line carefully, lips pressing together in what might have been admiration. Everything here is in order. Dellinger whispered to Caleb, We need time to reevaluate our position. Brant caught it instantly. Granted, she said, but let's be clear. You're not reevaluating her. You're reevaluating your mistake. The courtroom was still. Caleb's face twitched. Melissa's jaw worked soundlessly. Della hadn't spoken once. She didn't need to. Her silence had gravity now. The kind that pulled every eye toward her even when she barely moved. She sat poised, composed, every inch the woman they'd tried to make invisible. Judge Brant tapped her pen, the sound sharp and decisive. We'll set a review hearing for 10 days from now. During that time, the petitioners are to produce any legitimate evidence of incapacity or misconduct. If none exists, this case will conclude immediately. Caleb nodded stiffly, but his hand trembled where it rested on the table. Melissa whispered something to him, quick and heated, but he didn't look at her. Not once. Dean gathered his papers, sliding the binder back toward Della. 10 days, he said softly. That's all they've got left. Della closed the binder, the click of the latch final, deliberate. 10 days, she repeated, almost to herself. I waited longer for justice before. By Saturday morning, the courthouse tension had faded into the salt-heavy Savannah air. The weekend light poured gently through the stained glass windows of St. Martin's Church, washing the pantry tables in color. Ruby, gold, and sapphire hues, dancing over stacked cans and loaves of bread. Della Morris stood behind the folding table with her sleeves rolled up, her soft gray cardigan replaced by a faded blue apron that read, Serve with grace. She checked the list, restocked the fruit crates, and greeted each visitor by name. Morning, Mrs. Jenkins, she said warmly, handing over a paper bag filled with cereal and soup. And don't forget the orange juice. We got a new shipment yesterday. Mrs. Jenkins smiled shyly. You always remember the details. I'm a librarian, Della said with a grin. It's in the job description. Across the room, Norma snapped photos discreetly with her phone. Volunteers laughing, Della moving with the calm precision of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She captured Della walking steadily, lifting boxes, jotting notes on the clipboard with tidy handwriting. Documentation, yes, but also admiration. Don't overdo it, Della said as Norma approached, balancing a stack of donations. Norma winked. It's not overdoing when the truth's this easy to catch. You're sharper than ever, and I've got the photos to prove it. Della smiled, the corners of her eyes creasing. I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it because the pantry's running low on pasta. Outside, a sleek white SUV slowed at the curb. The tinted window rolled down halfway, Melissa. She stared at the scene, her expression a cocktail of disbelief and disdain. Della didn't notice her at first. When she finally did, it was only because Norma's face went still. Melissa's manicured fingers drummed on the steering wheel as she watched Della laugh with a young mother carrying a toddler. The sound didn't carry across the street, but her glare did. Sharp, surgical, resentful. Let her look, Della murmured softly, placing a loaf of bread into a shopping bag. If she wants proof I'm fine, she can get it right here. Melissa didn't roll her window up right away. She lingered, as if waiting for Della to break character, to stumble, fumble, forget. But Della didn't. She smiled, lifted another crate, and carried it to the back room with quiet strength. Finally, the SUV pulled away. Later that afternoon, in the pantry's small office, Della sat beside the pastor, signing a single-page document with deliberate strokes. "This is just a modest contribution," she said, handing over an envelope from her trust account. "For equipment and supplies." The pastor looked touched. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "That's why I wanted to." When she stood, Norma took one last photo, Della by the bulletin board, sunlight on her face, pen still in hand. By Monday morning, Dean Carver had those pictures printed, time-stamped, and enclosed in a sealed manila folder. He presented them to Judge Brandt with the same quiet pride Della carried in her smile. "Your Honor," he said, "this submission documents Mrs. Morris's regular volunteer work, including physical activity, community service, and financial contributions, all in line with her trust records. These images corroborate her civic engagement and cognitive stability." Brandt studied the photographs. Della handing out food, organizing bins, signing papers. Every gesture deliberate, calm, capable. "This is what you call evidence," Dean added. From across the room, Melissa scoffed, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through decorum. "Oh, please, a publicity stunt. She probably staged it just for these pictures." Dean didn't respond. He didn't need to, because Brandt's eyes had already snapped toward Melissa. "Mrs. Morris," the judge said slowly, "your mother-in-law spends her weekends feeding families while you spend yours inventing accusations. Which of those do you think the court finds more credible?" Melissa's face drained of color. Caleb shifted in his seat, looking anywhere but at her. Norma sat in the back row, biting back a victorious grin. Della didn't gloat. She simply straightened her papers, her face serene. "If helping people counts as a stunt," she said softly, "then I'll keep performing." The judge tapped her pen once. "Noted for the record." A hush fell over the room, heavy, final. The second hearing began with no preamble, no pleasantries. The courthouse clock hadn't even struck 10 when Judge Harriet Brandt entered, her black robe slicing through the stale morning air. "Let's cut to it," she said, lowering herself into the chair. "This isn't a soap opera, and we're not here to repeat ourselves." Her tone landed like a gavel before the actual one did. Dean rose immediately. "Understood, Your Honor." Caleb shifted beside Melissa, his posture rigid, his hands white-knuckled on the table's edge. Dellinger sat between them like a man trying to keep a pair of angry children from burning down a kitchen. Judge Brandt nodded toward Della. "Mrs. Morris, I understand you've prepared a statement?" Della stood, steady but not stiff, her binder already closed, as if she no longer needed it to hold her ground. She adjusted her glasses and unfolded a single page. Her voice, when she began, was clear and unhurried. "Your Honor, I've spent most of my life believing respect is earned by patience. I raised my son to be decent, to think before speaking, to build instead of destroy. But somewhere along the way, he learned that convenience can disguise itself as care. He and his wife convinced themselves they were helping me, when what they really wanted was control." Melissa rolled her eyes, but this time even that motion was quiet under the judge's watchful gaze. Della continued, "I may not move as quickly as I used to, but I am not fragile. I am deliberate. My finances are intact. My mind is clear. And my life is mine to live, not theirs to manage. I didn't come here for pity. I came here to prove that I still decide who I am." She folded the paper once and placed it on the table. "That's all I have to say." The silence afterward had weight, the kind that pressed into the ribs. Judge Brandt studied Della for a long moment, her eyes softening just a fraction. "Thank you, Mrs. Morris." Melissa couldn't help herself. "Oh, come on," she blurted, exasperated. "That little speech doesn't change the fact that she's been unpredictable. She hides things, she lies about—" "Mrs. Morris," Brant snapped, "one more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." Melissa's mouth slammed shut. Dean didn't look at her. He was already standing again, voice calm and deliberate. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, I'd like to submit an emergency motion for protective relief on behalf of my client." Caleb's head jerked toward him. "Protective relief? From what?" "From ongoing harassment and financial coercion," Dean said evenly. "We have documentation of repeated attempts by the petitioners to pressure Mrs. Morris into transferring funds and signing over control of her accounts, emails, texts, and—" He placed a printed set of messages on the evidence table. The judge gestured for the bailiff to collect them. Caleb's face flushed as the pages changed hands. Melissa leaned forward, whispering furiously, "They can't prove—" "Oh, they can," Dean interrupted softly, as if reading her mind. "Because the words came from your phone." Judge Brant skimmed the first few lines. Melissa's name, followed by messages written in that unmistakably flippant tone. "It's not like she needs that money anymore. We'll take care of her. Just sign the papers already." Brant's lips pressed together. "I see." Melissa started to speak again, but the judge's hand went up. "Enough. The record speaks for itself." Dean stepped back, his expression unreadable. "We request a temporary restraining order prohibiting further contact outside court proceedings until the review hearing concludes." The judge didn't deliberate long. "Granted," she said, "effective immediately. Caleb and Melissa Morris are to refrain from contacting Mrs. Morris directly or indirectly. Violations will result in contempt of court." Caleb shot to his feet. "So we're the villains now?" he demanded. Brant's gaze was ice. "If you weren't before, you've made a strong audition today." Norma couldn't help the small, incredulous laugh that escaped from the gallery. Dean gave her a warning glance, but the corner of his own mouth twitched. Della remained standing, her composure steady, almost regal. She didn't look at Caleb when she spoke, only at the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor. That's more than I expected." Brant nodded once. "You've earned it." Melissa slumped back, arms crossed, seething. Caleb's glare flicked between the judge, his lawyer, and his mother. But no one met it. Dean gathered his notes with quiet precision. "We'll see you in 10 days, Your Honor." Brant gave a single nod. Court adjourned. The gavel struck once. The 10th day arrived like a storm that refused to be quiet. Clouds hung low over Savannah, their gray weight pressing down on the courthouse dome. Inside, the air was even thicker, charged with something heavier than tension. Della sat beside Dean, her binder closed. She no longer needed to touch it. The papers had done their work. Now it was time for truth to stand on its own. Judge Brant entered precisely at 9. "Let's proceed," she said, voice even but edged with finality. "Mr. Carver, you have the floor." Dean stood. "Your Honor, before we move to final review, my office is filing a separate claim to recover funds withdrawn from Mrs. Morris's pension account." The sentence dropped like a stone. Caleb's head jerked up. Melissa's nails dug into her notepad. Dellinger blinked rapidly, flipping through his files as if he could locate surprise documentation by sheer panic. Brant leaned back. "Explain." Dean lifted a folder from his case. "Mrs. Morris's pension account shows several ATM withdrawals over a 3-month period last year, totaling just under $35,000. During that time, Mrs. Morris was hospitalized after a fall." He handed copies to the clerk. Withdrawals occurred in her home zip code, while she was physically incapable of leaving the hospital. The words struck like quiet lightning. Melissa was the first to recover. "She gifted that money," she said quickly, her voice just a little too high. She told us to take it for home expenses. We were helping her. Dean turned his head slightly. Do you have documentation of that alleged gift? Melissa blinked. It was verbal. Of course, Dean said softly, the faintest trace of irony under his professionalism. Caleb cleared his throat, trying to sound composed. We used some of that money to cover her yard maintenance, bills, groceries. It wasn't theft. Brant's gaze sharpened. Mr. Morris, were those payments made directly to vendors? Caleb hesitated. Some of them. Dean opened the next page of his packet. The bank provided transaction reports. The majority of the withdrawals were made in cash. Not checks, not direct payments. Brant scanned the pages, her eyes narrowing. These were taken from ATMs near your home address, Mr. Morris. Caleb's jaw tensed. I didn't realize that mattered. It matters, Brant said, each syllable clipped. Melissa crossed her arms. We didn't steal anything. We were managing her finances. She wasn't thinking clearly. That's an interesting argument, Dean cut in. Given that your earlier position was that she was perfectly capable when she allegedly gifted you the money. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke. Melissa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Della sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded on the table, fingers interlaced, her posture calm and unbending. Only the faint twitch at her jaw betrayed emotion, not anger, but something quieter. Sadness. Caleb slumped slightly in his chair. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he muttered, mostly to himself. But the judge heard him. Brant's voice was steady as she addressed the clerk. Mark Exhibit 12 as admitted. Copies to counsel and petitioners. She turned her attention fully to Caleb and Melissa. I have tolerated your disorganization, your disrespect, and your baseless claims. But this, she said, holding up the bank records, is something else entirely. Melissa's eyes filled with tears, sudden and theatrical. We were just trying to help her. Brant didn't blink. Help yourselves, you mean? Dean didn't smile, but the faint rise of his chin said everything. Caleb's attorney tried to interject. Your Honor, surely this can be resolved without escalation. Brant cut him off. This court is not in the business of burying evidence of financial exploitation. I will be referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review under Georgia elder abuse statutes. The sound of the gavel was almost drowned out by Melissa's choked gasp. Caleb looked as though someone had punched the air from his lungs. You're saying we're criminals now? No, Brant said evenly. I'm saying we'll find out. Della didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply looked at her son, really looked at him, and the silence between them spoke louder than any outburst could. Norma's hand rested against her heart in the gallery, pride and heartbreak mixing like light and shadow. Dean gathered his folders, his tone quiet but resolute. Your Honor, we'll await the DA's review and continue to represent Mrs. Pro. Morris, through the remainder of the proceedings. Brant nodded once. This hearing is adjourned pending investigation. The gavel fell again, heavy, final. 2 weeks passed before Della saw the courthouse again, this time only from her car window as she drove past it. The building that once loomed like a threat now felt like a relic, something she'd outgrown. Savannah's spring air was turning softer, filled with the scent of wisteria and the hum of second chances. On Sunday morning, the pastor at St. Martin's stopped her as she finished stacking hymnals in the back pew. Della, he said gently, our board met yesterday. The church would like you to serve on our legacy planning committee. We could use your organization, your steadiness. Della smiled faintly. Legacy planning, huh? Sounds like I'd be helping people think ahead. Exactly that, he said. You'd oversee charitable disbursements, endowments, and memorial funds. It's a responsibility we don't give lightly. Her fingers lingered on the back of the pew. "I'll do it," she said after a quiet breath. "But only if I can keep the coffee hour schedule too. They'll need both sides of me, the practical and the patient." The pastor laughed softly. "You've got yourself a seat." By the end of that week, Della sat at her kitchen table, the late afternoon light spilling over a row of typed letters and check stubs. 3 new scholarships, modest but meaningful, were finalized through her trust. Each one bore her late husband's name, the Thomas L. Morris Scholarship for Aspiring Teachers. She traced her finger over the embossed letterhead. He'd have loved this part: structure, purpose, helping kids find footing in a world that never stopped shifting. When the documents were ready, she called Norma. "Guess what you're doing today?" Della said. Norma's voice came through bright and teasing. "Judging by your tone, delivering good news and wearing something that doesn't clash with your calm." "Perfect," Della said. "I need you to take 3 envelopes downtown, to Dean." Dean Carver's office was quiet when Norma arrived. The waiting room smelled faintly of cedar and copy paper. She handed the envelopes across the polished desk with a satisfied grin. "From Della," she said. "And before you ask, yes, they're all notarized, organized, and probably more perfect than your filing system." Dean opened one, scanning the certificate and the accompanying trust confirmation. The golden seal shimmered in the afternoon light. "She did this on her own?" he asked. "Of course she did," Norma said. "I just carried the mail." Dean's smile was small but genuine. "Now this is how you build legacy," he said quietly. Norma crossed her arms, half proud, half amused. "Told you she wasn't finished writing her story." 2 days later, Della was back at home, tending the small azalea bushes by her porch when the mail carrier waved from the curb. "Certified letter, Mrs. Morris," he called. She signed for it, her pen steady even when she saw the sender's name. County Clerk of Courts, Savannah Division. Inside was a subpoena, not for her, but for Melissa. Tax review pending. Della's first instinct wasn't joy, it was exhaustion, the kind that sat behind the ribs and stayed there. She folded the paper neatly, set it on the kitchen counter, and poured herself tea. When Norma dropped by that evening, she found Della barefoot in her living room, the sunset spilling through lace curtains, a record humming softly. "They're finally being held accountable," Norma said, gesturing toward the subpoena. Della nodded slowly. "I never wanted them punished," she murmured. "I just wanted them stopped." Norma studied her, then smiled softly. "And now you're free to move on." The next morning, her phone rang. The number was familiar. Caleb's. She almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in her, the same part that remembered his first bike ride, his first scraped knee, made her answer. His voice was lower than she remembered, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Mom," he began, the word catching like gravel. "Can we talk? Just us?" Della said nothing for a long moment. The clock ticked softly on the wall, measuring out the space between past and possibility. "About what, Caleb?" she asked finally. "Everything," he said. "I think I finally understand what I did." Her breath came slow, even. "I don't know if I believe that yet." "I just want to see you," he said quietly. "Once. Please." Della looked out her window. At the garden, the azaleas blooming again despite everything. "I'll think about it," she said, and hung up gently before he could reply. Savannah's early summer light filtered through Della's kitchen curtains, pale and soft, the kind of morning that pretends life has no sharp edges. The kettle whistled, steady and calm, as she filled her mug and glanced at the newspaper left on her porch. Halfway down the front page was a headline she hadn't expected to see. "Local couple under financial investigation in elder abuse case." There were no names listed yet, but she didn't need them to understand. The weight of it settled over her shoulders like the humid air outside. By the time she reached Dean's office later that morning, he was already pacing. "It's time," he said. "We can't let this stay one-sided." Della folded her hands in her lap. "What do you mean?" Dean set a thin folder on the desk between them. Inside were printouts, social media screenshots, office emails, text exchanges. Melissa's words repeated across everyone. "She's losing it. The court's humoring her. The poor woman doesn't even remember where her money is." Dean continued. "Melissa's been spreading defamation at her workplace and online. She's painted you as senile, manipulative, even unstable. We're filing a claim for reputational harm, libel, slander, and defamation of character." Della's lips parted slightly, more in surprise than anger. "She's still talking?" "She's panicking," Dean said, "and panicking people talk loud." He placed another document in front of her, an official notice of claim. "We'll keep it clean, factual, unprovocative, but it'll stop her." Della took a long breath. If it protects the truth, then do it. 2 days later, Dean submitted the claim in probate and civil court. It included notarized evidence, Melissa's office communications, gossip she'd shared with coworkers about Della's decline, and the email where she'd written that the judge just felt sorry for an old woman with good handwriting. The employer was notified. Within 24 hours, HR had opened a formal review. Melissa arrived at work that Monday, coffee in hand and sunglasses perched high, until she was called into a glass-walled conference room by her manager and an HR representative. "We've received some concerns," the HR director began, tone neutral but heavy, "about statements you've made regarding an active court case and a family member." Melissa blinked, color draining from her face. "Wait, you can't... This was just..." The manager slid a paper across the table. "These were forwarded to us. Your professional email was used. You called a judge gullible, and you implied falsified legal documents." Her hand shook as she reached for the paper. "I didn't mean..." "I'm afraid intent doesn't outweigh evidence," the HR director said calmly. "We'll be conducting an internal review. Until then, you're on unpaid leave." Outside, the Savannah sun glared against the glass. Inside, Melissa's reflection looked small, blurred by tears and fluorescent light. Back at Della's home, the world was still and simple. She was at her kitchen table again, notebook open, jotting grocery lists in looping, careful script. She'd learned long ago that order, even in small things, keeps the soul steady. Norma walked in through the screen door without knocking, holding the day's mail. "Guess who's officially on leave?" she said, setting the letters on the counter. Della didn't look up right away. "Melissa?" "Word travels fast," Norma said with a satisfied grin. "Apparently, HR doesn't like when their employees run side gossip campaigns about judges and pension fraud." Della exhaled softly, the smallest ghost of a smile on her lips. "I never wanted to ruin her." "You didn't," Norma said, pulling out a chair beside her. "You let her do that herself. Some people use power. You used proof." Della glanced at her friend, then at the sunlight warming the edge of her notebook. "Proof lasts longer." Norma reached across and squeezed her hand. "And so do you." That afternoon, a journalist from the Savannah Journal left a voicemail on Della's phone. "Mrs. Morris, I'm writing a feature about elder financial abuse cases. Your story's made its way through the legal circuit. You've become something of a symbol for standing your ground. I'd love to interview you." Della listened to it once, then again. Her eyes moved toward the framed photo on the mantel. Her late husband smiling beside their younger selves, back when life still looked forward instead of back. She deleted the voicemail without replying. That night, she and Norma sat on the porch, the air buzzing with cicadas and the smell of honeysuckle. The horizon glowed orange as the day exhaled its last light. You could have been on the front page, Norma said softly. I already was, Della replied, in all the ways that mattered. They sat quietly, watching the stars blink to life one by one. Savannah's heat came early that June, the kind that made the air shimmer above the sidewalks and turned every porch fan into a small mercy. Della sat at Dean Carver's mahogany desk, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. The room smelled faintly of ink and cedar polish, the scent of decisions that lasted. I've reviewed your amendments twice, Dean said, sliding the stack of papers toward her. Once you sign, this becomes your final estate directive. Della studied the first page, her handwriting neat and deliberate on every line she'd dictated. All remaining assets, it began, are to be distributed to educational and community foundations, with specific allocations for the St. Martin's Pantry Endowment and the Thomas L. Morris Scholarship Fund. Her pen hovered just above the paper. And the exclusion clause? She asked. Dean nodded, turning to the second page. Right there. Standard legal language, but very clear. You've named Caleb and Melissa Morris as excluded parties. No inheritance, no trustee rights, no executor privileges. Della read the line slowly, tracing each word with her fingertip. Intentionally and with full awareness, I exclude the following individuals from any distribution of assets or residual estate holdings. Her chest ached, but it wasn't regret. It was release. I don't want vengeance in it, she said quietly. Just truth. Dean's expression softened. It reads like that, Della. Clean, unemotional, final. She signed each page with steady precision, the pen moving like it had a purpose larger than ink. When she reached the last page, she paused only once, at the signature line that bore her name beside her late husband's trust. For you, Tom, she murmured, and wrote the name she'd carried through 4 decades of marriage and 1 long war for dignity. Dean notarized it on the spot, his stamp firm and deliberate. Filed today, he said. This closes the book, Mrs. Morris. Della smiled faintly. Good. I've always liked tidy endings. That evening, the neighborhood seemed to hum differently. As Della walked her usual route through the oak-lined streets, the city felt lighter. Not because anything had changed around her, but because she had. She passed the community center where she'd once taught reading classes after retirement, now newly painted with funds she'd quietly donated through her trust. A group of teenagers leaned against the fence, laughing, their voices spilling through the humid air. One of them noticed her and waved. Hey, Mrs. M, you coming to the volunteer lunch Saturday? Wouldn't miss it, she called back, her smile reaching her eyes. Further down, she stopped outside the church pantry, the one she'd funded in silence for years. The new storage shed stood gleaming in the fading sun, the small plaque she'd refused to put her name on reading simply, "For those who build their days with kindness." She ran her fingers lightly across the lettering and whispered, That'll do. Across town, Melissa sat at her dining table, surrounded by unpaid bills and unopened letters. The soft buzz of her phone cut through the silence. Another notification, another creditor. She swiped it away, her eyes burning. The bankruptcy paperwork was already halfway complete. She didn't have to read the figures to know she'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Caleb hadn't come home since the district attorney's office called him in for questioning. On the kitchen counter, the latest Savannah Journal lay open, an article about Della's church fund circled in red marker. Local retiree establishes endowment for food equity programs. No mention of Melissa, no mention of Caleb, just Della. Dignified, steady, untouchable. Melissa crumpled the paper in her hands and whispered, She won. But the truth, the one Della would never need to say aloud, was that it had never been about winning. It had been about walking away whole. When Norma came by later that week, she didn't knock. She never did. The kitchen smelled like lemons and sugar, the scent curling through the air like sunlight. "Celebrating something?" Norma asked, setting down her purse. Della smiled as she placed a tray of cooling lemon bars on the counter. "Closure tastes better when it's homemade." Norma laughed. "Then pour me a coffee. I'm toasting to you." They sat together at the table, the kind of quiet friendship that didn't need words. Outside, the cicadas sang again, their song the same as it had been before everything changed. Proof that peace wasn't about forgetting, but surviving without bitterness. Norma took a bite and closed her eyes. Perfect. Just enough tart to keep it honest. Della laughed softly. "Like life, then." As evening fell, Della stood on her porch, watching fireflies spark across the lawn. Somewhere down the street, a car slowed, then stopped. Headlights flickered once, twice, before the engine turned off. She couldn't see the driver through the windshield, but she didn't need to. Some instincts never left a mother. The porch light bathed her in soft gold as she called into the night, her voice calm and unafraid. "If you came to talk, Caleb," she said, "you'll have to come up the steps and use your words." The car didn't move. The courthouse looked different that morning. Not larger, not smaller, just stripped of its threat. For Della, it wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a reckoning ground. The heat outside had already begun its slow climb, savanna air thick enough to hold the scent of magnolias and dust. Inside, the courtroom was still, the wood paneling polished and solemn, the same place where she'd once been dismissed as frail and inconsequential. Dean Carver stood beside her at the defense table, his suit sharp, his notes neat. But even he knew. Today was about something beyond paperwork. Judge Harriet Brandt entered precisely on time, the gavel rapped once, firm and final. "This is the concluding session in the matter of Morris vs. Morris," she began. "Over the past several months, this court has reviewed evidence, testimony, and documentation that detail a troubling pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and deception." She paused, scanning the room. Caleb and Melissa sat 2 tables away, separated by a silence so thick it hummed. Melissa's posture had collapsed inward, eyes red from lack of sleep. Caleb's jaw clenched and unclenched, the motion rhythmic and empty. "Throughout this case," Judge Brandt continued, "I've seen individuals attempt to weaponize the very systems meant to protect the vulnerable. That will not stand in this courtroom." The gallery behind Della was full. Neighbors, volunteers from St. Martin's, even 2 of the teenagers from the community center. Norma sat front and center, hands folded like a proud sentry. Brandt's gaze moved to Della. "Mrs. Morris, your documentation, your composure, and your understanding of the law have set a standard this court rarely encounters. You prove not only your competence, but your integrity. The record reflects that, and so will my ruling." Dean bowed his head slightly, but Della remained still. Brandt turned her attention to the petitioners. "Caleb and Melissa Morris," she said, her voice as level as a blade. "You filed baseless claims against your mother for guardianship and financial control. You falsified property documentation, engaged in unauthorized financial withdrawals, and attempted to defame her reputation both privately and publicly." Melissa's breath hitched. Caleb stared at the floor. "The evidence leaves no ambiguity," Brandt continued. "Your actions were deliberate, not misguided. Entitlement is not care. Control is not compassion." Caleb shifted suddenly, pushing back from the table. The scrape of the chair echoed through the courtroom like a shot. "I've heard enough," he muttered, standing. The bailiff stepped forward immediately. "Sir, you'll remain seated until the court adjourns." Caleb froze mid-motion, glancing toward the exit like a trapped man measuring the distance to freedom. But he sat back down, slowly. Melissa's eyes didn't move from the polished floorboards. Her hands gripped each other so tightly her knuckles whitened. Judge Brandt's gaze softened slightly, not for them, but for the wasted chances laid bare before her. "I hope you understand," she said, "that this outcome was always in your hands. You just refused to see it." Then she looked back at Della. "Mrs. Morris, this court formally closes the probate claim in your favor. Your trust stands as executed. Your estate remains under your exclusive control, and all guardianship petitions are dismissed with prejudice." A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Brandt raised her voice just enough to be heard above it. "However, before we adjourn, this court has one additional order to address." Dean's brow furrowed, flipping through his notes, but the judge continued before he could speak. "Mrs. Morris," Brandt said, "over the course of these hearings, this court has also reviewed unrelated casework brought to our attention. An elderly woman named Irene Talbot, age 76, currently facing coercion from her relatives regarding power of attorney and housing rights." Della blinked, uncertain where this was leading. Brandt leaned forward slightly. "The evidence in her file mirrors much of what we've seen here, except this woman has no advocate. Her caseworker petitioned the court for a temporary guardian with proven capacity and integrity." Dean looked up, realization dawning. The judge smiled faintly. "After review of your conduct and testimony, Mrs. Morris, this court intends to appoint you as Ms. Talbot's temporary legal guardian, pending her full restoration of independence. You will, of course, have the right to decline." The room was utterly silent. Even Caleb looked up. Della's throat tightened. For a moment she thought she might not find her voice, but when she did, it was steady. "If she needs help," she said softly, "then I'll do it." Judge Brandt nodded once, approvingly. "Then that's settled. The paperwork will be filed today. This hearing is concluded." The gavel came down. One last resolute strike. Dean turned to her, his voice low. "You just went from defending your life to protecting someone else's." Della looked at him, her smile faint but full of purpose. "It's what I was made to do, Dean. Some lessons don't expire." Norma was already standing in the gallery, clapping softly, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. Caleb didn't move. Melissa gathered her purse with trembling hands, her face blank. As Della rose, she didn't look their way, not out of cruelty, but out of peace. The kind that comes when a storm's done taking, and all that's left is clean air. She walked down the aisle slowly, the echo of her heels measured and sure. Outside, the courthouse doors opened to a flood of light so bright she had to shield her eyes. She breathed deep, the scent of summer, of new beginnings, and smiled to herself. The air in Savannah had turned gentler by mid-July, the kind that carried cicada songs and the smell of wet garden soil through open windows. Della Morris parked outside the modest white duplex on Mercer Avenue every Thursday afternoon, a folder tucked neatly beneath her arm. Irene Talbot's porch was shaded by overgrown jasmine vines, their blooms spilling over the railing like soft lace. Della knocked twice, the way she always did, not timidly, but with quiet respect. "Come in," came the faint voice from inside. Irene sat at her kitchen table, a pale woman with a small frame and eyes that had seen too much. Bills and insurance letters sat in a messy stack beside her coffee cup. When Della walked in, Irene smiled. Fragile, but real. "Afternoon, Mrs. Morris," she said, brushing crumbs off the table. "You always look like you have the answers in that folder." "Not answers," Della replied, setting it down. "Just reminders that you still have choices." She spent an hour helping Irene sort through her mail, marking the legitimate correspondence from the scams, circling the phone numbers that needed to be blocked. "Don't let them scare you with deadlines or big words," Della told her gently. "If it's real, it can wait for daylight." By the time Della left that first day, the table was clean, the letters filed, and Irene's hands had stopped trembling. In the following weeks, the visits became routine. Every Thursday, Della arrived with a tote of color-coded folders and a basket of cornbread wrapped in napkins. Sometimes Dean joined for an hour to explain the legal parts Irene didn't quite grasp, his calm voice steadying the air. Other times, Norma came along, tapping notes into her phone as they worked through the documentation together. "This clause here," Dean would say, sliding the paper forward, "protects you from any unauthorized withdrawals. No one gets access unless you say so." "And this," Norma added, pointing to a highlighted line, "make sure your healthcare decisions stay yours. You've earned that right." Irene would nod, tears gathering but never falling. "I thought getting old meant losing control," she whispered one afternoon. Della reached over and squeezed her hand. "Only if you stop paying attention. We don't fade. We just get underestimated." By early August, word had spread. The church newsletter ran a short piece about Della's guardianship work under the headline, "A librarian never retires from protecting stories." Below it was a photograph, Della and Irene smiling outside the courthouse, Norma standing proudly to the side, and Dean half smiling behind them, tie slightly askew. The caption simply read, "Community in Action." A week later, St. Martin's Church hosted its annual volunteer banquet. The evening air buzzed with laughter, clinking plates, and the faint melody of a piano in the fellowship hall. Halfway through dinner, the pastor took the stage, holding a small bronze plaque. "Tonight," he announced, "we honor someone who reminds us that advocacy doesn't end at a verdict. It grows after it." Della blinked, startled when her name was called. The applause rose around her like a tide, Norma whistling, Dean clapping politely beside her, Irene beaming near the front table. The plaque was simple, engraved with her name and the words, "For courage, clarity, and compassion in service to others." When the pastor handed it to her, Della hesitated only a second before saying, "All I did was listen and write things down. Sometimes, that's all people need to know they still matter." The audience rose to its feet. At the back of the room, one empty table remained, a place setting marked "Reserved." It had been mailed to Caleb and Melissa weeks earlier. Neither showed up. Later that night, back in her kitchen, Della pulled a manila envelope from her drawer and signed a single-page document inside. "Durable power of attorney, Norma Fielding." She didn't do it because she needed to. She did it because she trusted someone who had never once asked for anything. When Norma arrived the next morning with coffee and that familiar grin, Della slid the paper across the table. "Just in case," she said. Norma looked at it, then at Della, eyes soft with disbelief. "You trust me with all this?" "With everything," Della said. "You've already protected my peace. Now you'll just have the paperwork to match." Norma laughed, a tear escaping despite her effort to hide it. "Well," she said, wiping it away, "guess that makes me family." "You always were." They sat together in silence for a while, the kind that only old friends earn. Outside, church bells rang faintly in the distance, marking the hour. Della looked toward the sound and smiled. "You hear that?" she said softly. "Peace, ringing its own proof." That evening, as the sun bled gold through her curtains, Della sat down to write her first report as Irene's guardian. Her handwriting was as steady as ever. Status: client is stable, organized, and smiling again. At the bottom, she added a note for Dean. "P.S. Don't worry, I'm not overworking myself. Just overliving, maybe." She signed it with her usual flourish, closed the binder, and placed it neatly on her desk. The courthouse lobby looked smaller this time. The same pale marble, the same echo of shoes on tile, but no tension riding the air, no whispers, no smirks, no weight pressing against her chest. Della walked through the glass doors with her tote balanced against her shoulder, the same one she'd carried the first day, now worn soft at the corners. Inside it, no binders, no color-coded folders, just a manila envelope for Irene Talbot's case review and a small tin of lemon bars for the clerk, who'd always remembered her by name. The security guard at the metal detector smiled. "Morning, Mrs. Morris," he said. "Morning, Joe," she replied, her voice as even as her steps. "Quiet day?" He grinned. "Quiet's my favorite kind." She nodded, stepping through the scanner. "Mine too." As she crossed the lobby, sunlight slanted through the wide windows, pooling on the floor in soft squares. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and polish, but this time it carried no memory of fear. Then she saw them. Caleb and Melissa sat together on the same wooden bench where she'd once waited, their posture too still to be comfortable. Caleb's tie hung loose, his shoulders drawn. Melissa's hair was pulled back in a careful bun, but even from across the lobby, Della could see the fatigue etched into her face. They looked smaller now. Not physically, but in the way people shrink when life stops protecting them from consequence. Melissa was holding a stack of papers in her lap. Caleb's hands were clasped together, his thumb running over his wedding ring, twisting it slowly, over and over. For a brief moment, neither noticed her. Then Melissa's head lifted and froze. Her eyes widened just slightly, then darted to Caleb, who followed her gaze. The moment hung suspended in the hum of the lobby, three people who once shared a home, now sharing only silence. Della didn't slow her pace. Her heels clicked against the marble in steady rhythm, her chin lifted, her gaze fixed forward. She passed within arm's reach of them, close enough to hear the rustle of paper in Melissa's lap, the faint inhale Caleb took as if he might say something. But no words came. Della's heartbeat didn't waver. She didn't look down, didn't meet their eyes. There was nothing left to exchange. No apologies that could rewrite what had been done, no explanations that could soften what had been chosen. Outside, the air was warm and bright, the world moving at a slower rhythm than it used to. Norma's car idled at the curb, its windows down, the faint sound of an old country song drifting out. She had 2 coffees balanced on the dashboard. As Della stepped out into the sunlight, Norma grinned. "You're early," she said. "That a first?" "Last, probably," Della said, smiling back. Norma handed her the coffee. "How'd it go in there?" "No fireworks," Della said. "Just signatures and quiet." "Perfect," Norma replied. "That's your kind of victory." They stood there for a moment, the courthouse looming behind them, its glass doors reflecting the blue Savannah sky. A breeze passed, carrying with it the faint echo of church bells from several blocks away. Della took a sip of coffee and exhaled slowly. "It's strange," she said. "I used to walk out of there shaking. Today, I didn't feel a thing." "That's peace," Norma said simply. "It sneaks in when you stop waiting for applause." Della turned her head slightly, glancing through the glass one last time. Through the reflection, she could still see Caleb and Melissa, 2 silhouettes frozen on the bench. This time, it wasn't pity that stirred in her. It wasn't even anger. It was something quieter. The understanding that some endings don't roar. They fade. Norma watched her watching them. "You don't have to look back," she said softly. "I know," Della said, turning away. "But sometimes it's good to see where you stopped carrying the weight." They climbed into the car, the engine humming to life. As they pulled away from the curb, the courthouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror, swallowed by sunlight and distance. Della rested her hand against the cool window glass, the city rolling by, the church she loved, the pantry she'd funded, the park where children ran past the new bench she'd donated in Tom's memory. The world had gone on, and so had she. Norma glanced over. "Done?" she asked. Della smiled, slow and certain. Done. They turned down Oglethorpe Avenue, the morning light scattering through the oak trees, dappling the dashboard with moving gold. Della took one last look at the courthouse fading in the distance, not as the place where she was challenged, but the place where she reclaimed herself. They rolled their eyes at a courtroom entrance, she said quietly, almost to herself. I exited with my legacy and their lesson. Norma smiled, eyes on the road. And what's the lesson exactly? Della leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. That you can't steal from someone who remembers everything. Not the money, not the truth, not even her peace. The car turned a corner and the courthouse vanished from sight, leaving only the sound of cicadas, the hum of summer air, and the echo of quiet victory that no one could ever take from her again.